series. My name is Ammara Durrani, and I'll moderate okay, our discussion today on war as system shock, economic spillovers, energy security, and Pakistan's fiscal balance. Since 2020, the global economy has been shaped by shocks: COVID-19, the Ukraine war, and now the escalation of the US-Iran conflict. These shocks have destabilized energy market and global trade. The current conflict has already run into tens of billions of dollars in military expenditure, with hundreds of thousands of lives lost across the region and significant damage to critical infrastructure. Oil prices are volatile, with risk premiums tied directly to disruptions in the Gulf and Strait of Hormuz. As the stalemate continues, disruption in oil supplies for Asia in particular is a real possibility. This has direct implications for inflation, trade balances, and fiscal stability for all countries. Pakistan, operating under a $7 billion IMF program, faces tighter constraints. Its total public debt exceeds $130 billion, with limited fiscal space to absorb repeated external shocks. To unpack these dynamics and what they mean for Pakistan's economic resilience and strategic positioning, I'm joined this evening by a distinguished panel of experts who bring outstanding experience across policy, finance, and geoeconomics. Welcome Dr. Ishrat Hussain, who needs no introduction. He's former governor of the State Bank of Pakistan, professor emeritus at IBA, former advisor to the Prime Minister on reforms, recipient of Nishan-e-Imtiaz, and author of numerous books and monographs. Welcome Dr. Zeelaf Munir, who's chairperson of the Pakistan Business Council and managing director and CEO of English Biscuit Manufacturers, one of the country's largest FMCG companies. She also serves on multiple institutional boards and regularly contributes to the national and international policy platforms. Welcome Mr. Adnan Pasha Siddiqui, who is currently advisor to Pakistan's Federal Finance Minister and member Bretton Woods Committee. He spent 30 years in global markets and investment banking, advising sovereigns and MNCs on transformation and sustainable growth. And last but not the least, Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, welcome, who is a leading Pakistan economist and policy expert with extensive experience in government and international development. His work focuses on macroeconomic policy, trade, energy, economics, and regional connectivity. Dr. Ishrat, let me start with you in this overall context of global conflict and volatility. Do you see the Bretton Woods system holding, or do you think this is the beginning of a structural reordering of global economic and trade systems? And how do you see Pakistan positioning itself in this milieu?
Well, thank you, Ammara, for inviting me over to this panel. I would go back to 2015-16, when the US government elected President Trump as the president of the US. And the global economic order, which was in existence and was doing extremely well since 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed, was under threat. And that was because Mr. Trump's policy was Make America Great, and which was isolationist policy and keeping away alliances, multilateral institutions, and liberal trade, which characterized the entire transformation of the global economy during 25 years, which led to a buoyant growth, and the developing countries particularly benefited from that. 1.2 billion people were lifted out of poverty, and China emerged as a rival economic power, becoming the second largest economy and the world's first trading nation. And that put the United States at a little bit of back foot, because they were the preachers of the globalization, free trade, financial market integration, technological transfer, migration. All these were the elements which actually helped all the countries. and there was a setback, and that setback has nothing to do with either the Ukraine war or the COVID or the present war, but that has to do with this complete rethinking of the economic order. And that is the rivalry between China and the United States, which is going to create a new world order. And that, I think, is something we have to think about as a structural break rather than these erratic shocks to the global economy. And I'm sure, depending on the intensity and the duration of this war with Iran, things will come back as they did after COVID and after they have actually subdued after the Ukraine war. So I'm not so much concerned, but I'm more concerned about the shape of the new global order and the less emphasis on multilateralism. For example, Trump has already quit WTO, he has quit WHO, he has quit UNESCO. He doesn't want to give money to United Nations, even for humanitarian assistance. He has disbanded the USAID, and that's being followed by the Europeans and the Britishers. And that, I think, to me, is the danger for the developing countries.
Right. So Dr. Zeelaf, let me come to you. Dr. Ishrat looks at a changing economic order more to do with great power competition between the US and China. And he thinks his view is that the shocks are kind of a secondary driver. Let me bring your focus to immediately to Pakistan. As a business representative, Pakistani businesses have been battling these shocks one after the other, and they've done a remarkable job surviving resiliently. And this when we are under IMF discipline. So, from a business perspective, when you look at Pakistan's ongoing reforms and support from friendly countries, do you think that is sufficient to steer the country towards stabilization, or do you think we are approaching systemic limits? And especially when you consider the point about US China competition made by Dr. Ishrat. Dr. Zilaf.
Thank you very much, Ammara. It's a pleasure being this August panel. So, just to take what Dr. Ishrat was saying forward, the new global world order, the shocks are the system, I believe. Since the US has kind of extenuated uh, what its role was post World War II to what it seems to be now uh, in the liberal world order. And yet at the same time, we don't believe that China is really filling or is wanting to fill that gap in terms of that role of maintaining that order. So I think, yes, one would be thinking along lines of maybe a Cold War 2.0, China versus US rivalry, or more fragmentation. But I think another interesting way to look at it is also how the development of the middle power countries can be taking place and what kind of coalitions and alliances and what that is going to mean for trade and global trade, and which, of course, with the position that Pakistan is in, would definitely also be affecting us. So it's a more fluid architecture, so the middle powers, they can be exercising their collective weight on specific issues without really picking great power camps. So whether Brazil, South Africa, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, all can be considered middle power countries. So economies that are too significant to ignore, but unwilling to be drafted in either the side of the US or the China contest rather. So that's a view that I did want to bring in, actually in continuation of what Dr. Ishrat was saying. Now coming to uh, Pakistan and how the businesses are managing. Now, where the world order was concerned, it was over the past 3 decades built on efficiency driven value chains, extraordinary expansion of global trade, whereby overall trade was around 57% of the world GDP. And in the New World Order, global trade is not disappearing, but it is slowing down, becoming more fragmented, and reconfiguring into new regional patterns. Yes, COVID showed how fragile the efficient supply chains are. Ukraine war, how interdependence can be weaponized. US Iran conflict is showing that even energy choke points we treated as permanent infrastructure are now open to disruption. So, for businesses, this is not abstract. Capital today is pricing permanent volatility into investment decisions. Board decisions, supply chains, capex calls being made across the private sector, all of it now operates on different assumptions than in 2019. So, no supplier, no geography, no sovereign is risk free anymore. And climate disruption sits underneath all of it as a permanent shock, with countries like Pakistan absorbing costs we did not even create. So, now, talking about the systemic limits and getting to the IMF program, uh, are we at our systemic limits? I would argue we are past systemic limits, not approaching them. We hit the wall in 2023 when reserves dropped down to 2.92 billion, less than a month of imports, and the country stood weeks from default. Everything since then has been about whether we can use the time we have purchased before the next shock arrives. So the stabilization since 2023 has been real, and the financial managers deserve credit for that. S&P and the State Bank of Pakistan point towards a stable macroeconomic trajectory for Pakistan, characterized by moderate inflation, controlled external imbalances, and steady GDP growth. But has it been done through the reforms? I would argue no, because it has been externally funded, including through the IMF programs. And Saudi Arabia, Qatar, China have provided fresh funds that roll over, delayed payments, and are plugging in the holes, so that to ensure that the planned build-up of the State Bank of Pakistan forex reserve, projected at 18 billion by the end June, stays. So when so the under the IMF discipline, the reform momentum has been there for the past 2 years. The point is, what stabilized the economy were not the reforms themselves. That distinction matters for how we judge whether reforms enacted are sufficient as shock absorbers. So, as an example, crude oil prices are up nearly 50% since late Feb, with monthly import bill rising by an estimated 600 million. The government has had to already cut 173 billion from the PSTB. Now, in the past 2 years, over 660 reforms have been enacted across 135 institutions, with the energy sector alone accounting for 118 of them. The IPP renegotiations was a part of it, and so was the circular debt resolution. But the reforms enacted so far have not led to investment. Until the local investors start investing, FDI will remain elusive. The test of whether the reforms are trusted is the investment rate. And businesses do not put capital in a country where they think the rules will reverse. So Pakistan's fixed investment is 11.9% of GDP, South Asia's 27.8. And this gap is, I believe, the private sector's verdict. So capital has not yet voted that the reforms are durable. Until it does, the reform story remains forecast. So now this happens each cycle. external relief, no structural follow through, return to crisis, windfall inflows used to delay complementary domestic reform rather than accelerate it. So, now talking about what would be sufficient. Now, instead of a laundry list of reforms, we need to address the binding constraints which has the greatest possibility of multiplier effects for the economy. So, in our view, the government should be getting out of the way of the private sector, reduce regulations across the board for the private sector and investment frameworks, and reform the tax and energy policy. Now, this cannot happen in a significant way without addressing the political economy and the bureaucratic choke points. The next, what I would also recommend is converting the friendly country relationships from deposits to investments, which is also like an immediate measure, with Saudi Arabia holding 8 billion in deposits and China 4 billion. So these liquidity instruments, they should be invested to build productive capacity and create perpetual rollover dependencies. Instead of perpetual rollover dependency, the relationships need to convert into equity investment in productive sectors where inflows build capability, jobs, and generate returns rather than simply postponing the next forex crunch. So, in terms of you were referring to in the current scenario, in the current situation, where the mediation role is concerned and what the recommendations for that would be, I would keep that for your
For the
next
later
question on
yes,
what
yes.
Pakistan's role would be. But I think from the business point of view, where the reforms are concerned, where the structural re-engineering is concerned, we see genuine efforts towards it over the past 2 years, but to be able to break that wall, there is significant constraints that need to be overcome.
Thank you, Dr. Zeelaf. That's really a very comprehensive kind of a report card evaluation of, how the government is trying to balance reforms with fiscal constraints and also taking advantage of the moment. Adnan, this brings me to you. The business community's verdict is still on hold. When we know that wars are always costly, and we should remember that Pakistan was also in a state of conflict last year. That also had its cost. But we know, looking at history, that wars generate new economic value chains also. And this is something that Dr. Zeelaf is very clearly, I think, wisely pointing out to. And Pakistan has always done well to leverage conflict for economic gain historically. Now, in your view, what economic opportunities does the current Pakistani mediatory role, which has been, globally acknowledged and appreciated, what are the opportunities that it brings for Pakistan? Do you see a real conversion of successful diplomacy into dollar-term dividends investments that Dr. Zeelaf thinks we ought to?
Ammara, thank you very much. Thanks to you, your team at the Jinnah Institute. And it's wonderful to be on this panel. Just a little context setting. I don't disagree with the panelists on most of the stuff they're saying. From my perspective, not just being part of the current administration, but just keeping sort of the global macro in mind. Pakistan, like every other country, must now decide not whether to ride this out, but how to reposition itself. Yeah, that's very critical. And we don't want to be in a situation that, we get sidelined by a lot of the international players. But at the same time, we need to make sure that our reform agenda continues at a steady pace. When you discussed systemic limits, we are not at limits today, but the margins between the managed stress and the fiscal crisis is narrow. This is being proactively managed. However, you know what's going on. The ECC also looked at the price stability today as well, particularly the price movements of the essential commodities. With reinforced oversight and timely interventions, we're trying to make sure commodity prices start returning and they are closer to pre-volatility benchmarks. there are triggers, and I should point those out because there are triggers that, because of this volatility and because of uncertainty, people should be aware, what can go wrong, and there are known knowns, as you know, there are known unknowns, and we're looking to plan with those. And this is being done proactively by the administration and in conjunction with the provincial governments as well. So the first thing I'd say is the prolonged closure or the uncertainty around the Strait of Hormuz, so higher energy costs, but the volatility around that, and then the availability of that, because we are dependent on energy imports, even though we over 50% is being generated from renewables, but there is this element that will filter in at some stage, maybe not now, but if it gets worse, then into inflation. The home remittance, that corridor is very important for us. Hopefully that doesn't impact us in a significant manner. It hasn't up until now, but we need to be wary of that. And this is a geo-economic sort of dilemma that we're dealing with. The slippage in the IMF program arising from the second and third order impact of this US-Iran conflict, the potential inflation I mentioned, export declining, something that Zeelaf had mentioned, or the remittance impact, energy and logistics cost escalation. Leading also, another issue is the food security element, because fertilizer, by 30%, I was not aware till recently, the 30% was coming through the Strait of Hormuz to other parts of the world. We're in a good situation, by the way, on that. Having said that, we still need to, have the ability to maintain strategic reserves, not just on fertilizer, but energy, related reserves. So that's something we're working on. Now, at the recent meetings that just concluded, the tone was of caution, by other member country delegations as well, and that we should be aware that we are not the only one, that is planning. Everyone is concerned. They're also going to be saying what's important for them as a nation, to perform. But having said that, I think even before the war started, Pakistan has delivered under incredibly difficult conditions. Zeelaf mentioned that, and I can say that because from the front row seat, we've been experiencing it. We've concluded the EFF third review, executed the SLA with the IMF just recently. In fact, the IMF MD has praised our efforts on the progress being made thus far on the reform agenda. Let me just tell you that. Yes, I agree that this can be, accelerated, and I will come to that before I tell you, what are the, let's say, the key things we should look at from a policy perspective. But we have secured financing, as you know, external financing for this fiscal year, and created room for the forthcoming fiscal year. Much work still ahead of us to ensure that we carefully navigate this uncertainty, arising from the crisis, and then we convert these into opportunities. But having said that, we need to stay the course on the IMF program, and because it's built on a lot of the reforms that Zeelaf is talking about, and we want to deliver on. Secondly, but just as critical, we must continue with these reforms concurrently. What are these? First of all, in my opinion, in terms of priority, FBR reforms, SOEs, privatization, and then following through on the long-standing government right-sizing leading to the comprehensive civil service reforms. When it comes to that, a lot of that reform, specifically the right-sizing civil service, we've picked up the playbook recommended by Dr. Ishrat Hussain, to a previous administration. And, he'd made some very constructive recommendations that we now want to carry forward, in this administration and deliver on them. Now, it should be more time-bound. I agree. We are keeping that in mind. There are stakeholders, in the country that we are working with on that. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Hussain, for laying the foundations, and inshallah, we intend to deliver on that for Pakistan. Reforms will just buy us time. What needs to convert, the opportunity is and taking it from stabilization to growth is locking in these economic value chains. Again, Zeelaf had mentioned that earlier, but the goodwill that Pakistan has created for itself with this masterly facilitation and mediation during this conflict we should negotiate with relevant stakeholders to recalibrate or find relief on stringent terms, especially those associated with our energy complex. We should also ask for concessions on the long pending Pakistan-Iran gas pipeline. It's critical for our energy security. So I'm looking at from a security perspective here. It's not just what's good for today. We're looking at 10, 20 years ahead, just like food security, just like water security. And we should also invite strategic partnerships from the United States as well, and China and the EU, on mutually beneficial projects that create jobs for Pakistanis and lead to transfer of critical knowledge. Example is, data centers, critical minerals value chain, and the value chain, not just mining, but the local processing and then the re-export of it, leading in also to opportunities on the port logistics part. So the government wants entrepreneurship to flourish. We're here to assist and facilitate and support the private capital that Zeelaf had mentioned to invest in Pakistan. And again, till the Pakistani investors don't look at enterprise in that manner, and they don't see us forthcoming with their requirements, to sort of facilitate them properly, we should not actually expect someone else to come in and do that, that gap funding. So we're ready to create an enabling environment. However, incentivization needs to be time bound and linked to specific outcomes in terms of job creations and indigenization of the industry. We've redesigned and we're refining our policies. The NEV policy also came out. We're working on industrialization policy to provide also a level playing field. We're removing the roadblocks, the human element, as you know, when it comes to FBR, AI-enabled digitization for greater transparency and efficiency. It's very important for investors, including, PBC and all the chambers mentioned that. So, the customer journey or the investor journey has to be pleasant, not cumbersome, not turbid or turgid, as it is at the moment. It's improving, but it can now accelerate because the processes have been tested and now implementation stage is there. So now in order to encourage FDI, we also want more pairing up with the local businesses. So whether it's the United States or China, or if investors coming in from Central Europe, because that will then create and retain wealth and jobs in Pakistan. That's very important for us. The country, that the way we're growing, we need to create at least 3 million jobs every year. Now, how do we do that? It'll be local industry and along the value chains. Again, FDI flows to any emerging economy. There has to be certainty on repatriation of dividends. That's very clear. I think everyone here knows that. So, we have in the last 2.5 years managed to normalize that risk. And a lot of people here know that. Now we need to codify it. This is something that the finance minister also mentioned at the recent RDA launch. He was calling it RDA 2.0. And there was a roadshow done in DC 2 weeks ago. And we did mention that, when people felt uneasy 2.5, 3 years ago, no one stopped money flowing out. The banks were not stopped by the Central Bank of Pakistan. Funds, if anyone wanted their funds back, they got their funds back. Similarly, there were slowdowns. Yes, we know 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, on the dividend payments. Now that's all normalized, right? So I'm actually very happy to tell you that that's something that we're keeping in mind. And because of that, the sort of external financing that is coming in now from the commercial side as well, they're finding that as a confidence building measure. And all of these initiatives will also help us in our credit ratings side. Now, coming to the dollar dividends or the hard dividends that we can potentially extract from the current situation. Look, Pakistan has played a very significant role back even in 1971, the Kissinger-China opening. Right? It stood then and now we are at a critical juncture in the global structural transformation. President Trump has credited the ceasefire to conversations being initiated and helped on by Field Marshal Asim Munir Saab, our Honorable Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif Saab. Even the Iranians, their foreign ministers publicly thanked Pakistan. for the tireless effort. So we have this first dividend that came in has already materialized. Pakistan's port in Karachi, the transshipment volumes in 20 to 30 days, that exceeded in the last 20, let's say, month, has exceeded the entire previous year, right, in terms of volumes coming into Karachi. So we must urgently work with the private sector to figure out how we can make these gains permanent, to the extent that they can be made permanent, given the current infrastructure, and then what sort of investments may be required with partnerships, more partnerships with foreign companies potentially.
Right. Right. So,
Just as a diplomatic capital element, there's a time limit to everything. And Zeelaf had alluded to that earlier, and I agree on that. There's an expiry date, and we must convert that before the window closes. We should look at, I'm sitting in the US now, but we should offer this to EU and China, critical minerals value chain, exploration, processing, export, opening up the space for IT market access and data centers, finding solutions to ease the fiscal burden, linking to, repaying energy-related commitments. Also, an example is the knowledge industry, inviting US universities, Chinese universities, research institutions to Pakistan to develop a knowledge industry in Pakistan. An example is, Dr. Ishrat is very well aware, IBA, started in 55. For 10 years, they had an agreement with the University of Pennsylvania and then Southern California. Knowledge transfer, building up skill sets. And now we need to do that on the technical and vocational side as well, because we are looking to export, our human capital as well. So we should take this opportunity and ask our partners on that.
So thank you, Adnan. That's a immediate to long-term policy vision that you very comprehensively outlined. I think a very important takeaway that I'm taking from Dr. Zeelaf and yourself is the criticality of time. Criticality of honoring this very tight time window of opportunity that Pakistan has. And this remains in place while there's still a global war, a regional war in place. So let me come to you, Vaqar. You have your very close monitoring on the forthcoming budget. This is going to be an immensely pressured budget, at least to a common person's mind. How do you view, the current environment, macro and foreign environment impacting Pakistan's fiscal planning for the next, 12, 18 months? And I would very politely, still kind of remind colleagues that in case this war continues, there is a very likely possibility of real energy shortages. So, what would be our preparation strategy for that? Vaqar, over to you.
Thank you, Ammara, and thank you to colleagues at Jinnah Institute for inviting me. I think I've hugely benefited from the interventions of my esteemed panelists. I think you've asked probably the right question at this juncture in the discussion. While, of course, we must congratulate the government on the diplomatic efforts, as well as on walking a very difficult path on keeping the supply chains running. At the same time, I would say that they have an even more difficult task of not only negotiating the forthcoming budget with the fund, but also giving a plausible budget which sticks for the next sort of 12 months or so, without going into a mini budget immediately after June, if, for example, the horizon of this conflict expands. So this is a very tough spot to be in. And I think it's important to note that while we are, of course, discussing that until now, we have been able to sail through based on the macro numbers. Today, we have seen in the monetary policy statement as well that still, of course, the economy is trying to walk on the path of a very fragile recovery. The risks have been identified by the central bank, These aren't new, of course, but I think the perception of these risks has now grown stronger, given that the timeline of this conflict or resolution of this conflict is not in sight. Which now brings me to the reality which is being faced by the budget maker in this country, anyone who's making the budget in Adnan Saab's office at the federal level or at a provincial level. So the reality is that you've got rising inflation. The cost of production is increasing by the day. And you have seen in day before yesterday's sensitive price index that it's now in double digit, will not come back very quickly to the pre-conflict levels. In fact, may never come back given our COVID experience. So what does this mean? This means that you have a private sector now who's going to who's being asked to adapt, of course, given the external shock. Would they be able to do it? Do they have the buffers or not? The larger enterprises, maybe. The micro, small, and medium enterprises, no. So in our survey, concluded last week, you're looking at almost 120 to 150 formal SMEs shutting down every week. They're not going bankrupt, but they can't meet their working capital needs, which means that they are not taking any further orders. You're looking at least 2 to 3 exporting firms per week who are trying to defer their orders, given that they have imported raw material supplies which are either not coming or coming with a delay or coming at a price which they cannot sustain. So this is the reality which they are facing. You talk to the retailing firms, they are saying that our footfall is now down to 1/3. So now nobody is to blame over here, given that it's an external shock. I think the key question that we in a public-private dialogue need to ask ourselves is that given the situation and given that economy needs to be stabilized, given that we want to honor what we have signed with the IMF, how do we lower taxes in such an environment? If we have to bring back growth, if we have to make these SMEs survive, or even for the larger firms, how do you lower taxes in such an environment? How do you lower power tariffs? A key ingredient in your cost of production. How do you bring down the cost of oil in such an environment? 60% of imported oil going into your transport sector. Would you be able to budget a lower PDL in the next budget? Would IMF allow that? How does one lower trade taxes? And then maybe how do you reduce the compliance costs? In every budget, comes April, comes May, these are the questions that we are discussing with the government. And now I think we're in a fix that where do we go from here? And I think private sector needs help, but government needs more help.
Yeah.
Over to you, Ammara.
Vaqar, thank you. I think I personally tend to agree with you that we are really in a fix. And when I listen to Dr. Zeelaf and Adnan, there seems to be a big expectation from the private sector to just step up and solve. And I wish to come to Dr. Ishrat Hussain. Dr. Saab, do you think that wish for the private sector to step up and somehow help the government share the burden is realistic? Because I think Vaqar is right. There is help needed from the government and from the fund. What's the way forward?
Ammara, before I answer that question, let me thank Adnan for pointing out the right sizing. But I would like to add, Adnan, that I have been emphasizing that right sizing of the government in absence of the capacity building of the civil services is just not going to make the effect. We can shuffle the boxes, but the capacity of the government right now, both at the federal and the provincial government, has eroded so much as compared to even 5 years ago, that unless we fix that, we are not going to get the benefits which you have. I also, as you remember, authored the SOE triage report, where we decided which should be privatized. When I look at the boards of some of the SOEs which have been retained, I'm not extremely happy about it, because they are the result of the compromises made by the political parties that in this board, my persons should be nominated. Whether they are competent or not, that is not happening. So you may have a very good policy and a very good law which has been endorsed by the World Bank and IMF and everybody, but the actual execution is a problem as far as I am concerned during this whole journey which I have been watching for the last 25 years. When we have execution capability, for example, during the COVID period, we did very well despite all the difficulties, and the growth rate was quite high. So unless we tackle this problem, we created this process of open, merit-based, transparent appointment of the MDs and CEOs of the public sector entities. And you would remember that 14 expatriate Pakistanis left their jobs in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Jeddah, in London to come and take over. And some of them have done wonders. Look at the Marie Gas. Look at the State Life Insurance. I mean, I can go on examples. That is where the, emphasis should be, not on changing the boxes or right sizing. That is alone cannot do this.
So let me, Dr. Saab, then ask you the most critical question, especially in terms of the very urgent nature of the challenge that Vaqar has rightly put his hand on. What is Pakistan's best bet for the next 18 months or 12 months?
I was coming to that, but let me complete. Behind every crisis, and I submit this, I've been arguing this, I've been writing this, whether it is an energy crisis, or it is the taxation crisis, or it is the education crisis, any crisis, it is the failure of the governance and the institutions of governance. Nothing more than that. You can manage that. And that, I think, requires the civil service reforms, where we have 2 years consultative sessions with 60 different groups of the people, 3,000 people who came to this conclusion that right from the selection and induction to right away to the severance and retirement, we have to change the present structure. It is not capable. And I can assure you that if you make that change right now, it will take some time. I'm not saying this, but the entire system will respond to the same incentives and will remove the same constraints which Zeelaf pointed out, which are helping the private sector. Now, coming back to your question, Ammara, I would submit that this diplomatic victory which Pakistan has put itself on a radar of the world, and before that, the military superiority which we have demonstrated, these two Ds, diplomacy and defense, will not make Pakistan a visible player in the International Committee of Nations unless we do look at the 3D, which is the development of this country, socio-economic development. And we have to transit now, take this opportunity from doing business as usual to a new paradigm. Let me say very humbly that I am not very pleased that we took another 3 billion from Saudi Arabia to replace the UAE. My submission is that we have to find ways in order to liquidate these short-term liabilities. in a way in which the private sector as well as the government sector can mobilize resources. And the list is, Zeelaf has pointed out, everybody, PBC has, ICCI has, we know what needs to be done. Why can't we see that if $500 million can be mobilized by a group of investors to purchase PIA, and another $500 million, which was by the second group, $1 billion is on the table.
Sir.
That is in the private sector. But why? You are in a regime where the people who are compliant with the taxes, they are paying 50 to 60% of their income towards the taxes. You have intercorporate dividends, which reduces the incentive for capital formation by the big groups. Now they are ₹1 trillion market cap. You remove these constraints and difficulties which are known to everyone, and you can see that the private sector will respond. I look at the cash statements of these 5 or 6 big mega, and I can say, look, we can have large projects. Ask them to go for the large projects over a long term with a private-public partnership, where government makes the land available to them, the utilities available to them, all the infrastructure, and let them invest. We have all these special economic zones with China. They are just sitting there. So please consider that this begging of the money, which Prime Minister rightly pointed out, that he feels below his dignity to go and knock at the doors of Saudi Arabia, China, and UAE, that please renew our deposits. This is not the name. And our diplomatic victory today and our military prowess should be taken to the third step, which is that we try to create an environment where both the government and the private sector work together in order to take this country from a perpetual state of stabilization to the growth. You have a large number of youth coming out. I go to all the universities in Pakistan, and I tell you there's a despondency among them. They ask 2 questions from me, which I had never heard before. Which is the country where can I get a visa very easily? And second, which is the university where I can get admission very easily? These are the 2 questions which are being asked from Gilgit-Baltistan to Gwadar. That's not very good for the country that your youth is being very disillusioned about it. So we have to change the paradigm from going to IMF all the time, get the relief and stabilize the economy, but the long-term growth impulses, which should have been taken care of through a long-term and medium-term plan of action, where every government which comes to power continues that. And I give the example of India and Bangladesh, my book on development pathways. India's Narasimha Rao's reforms did not actually have any impact till Vajpayee from the opposition came to power, and he continued with the same. And then Manmohan Singh came and Modi came, and all of them continued with the same reforms. And India has got 6 to 7. Khalda Zia and Hasina Wajid were fighting with each other politically. They were called battling Begums, but the economic policies remained the same. And the garment industry decided, well, inko aane do, jane do, hamari policies same rahengi, and $45-50 billion is the exports of. And here, Nawaz Sharif Saab started in 1991 the economic reforms. He was removed after 2 years. The new government came in, started their own policies. They went in, then Nawaz Sharif Saab came. He was struggling with another set of problems. We didn't have. If we had continued with those reforms, we would have been in the same shape. Now, even in the same government of the same party, I have observed that the new prime minister and the ministers come and they say, हमने अपना नाम बनाना है, पिछले को क्रेडिट क्यों जाए, हम अब अपनी चीज शुरू करेंगे. By the time वो अपनी चीज शुरू करते हैं, पिछला वाला जो है, that has all disappeared to oblivion, and the new projects and new policies do not have an impact. We are jogging on the same spot, we are moving forward. That, to me, is the major issue. The country had a track record of being one of the top developing countries from 1950 to 1990. India was growing only by 3%, we were growing by 6%. In the 2002 to 2008, we were growing at 6 to 7% consistently. Our exports had tripled, and our FDI was $9 billion, which has never happened. Investment GDP ratio had gone to 20%. So this country can deliver, but it is to be managed in a sensible way, and the political economy has to decide that we have to look to the national interest rather than to our parochial interest and the self-interest. So to me, that is where we are stuck. And there is no other way but to change the course we have. We don't have to be running to the fund or to the other bilateral donors. We have to mobilize the resources. 60% of your economy outside the manufacturing and the formal sector doesn't pay any taxes. And every time, and in Musharraf's government also, we tried, there was a hartal, and all the politicians say, "Ji, maaf karo inko, tax na karo." And that is happening even today. The tax GDP ratio has remained stagnant because 60% of your taxpayers are not paying, while 40% are overburdened and they have no incentive to invest. So these are the things which have been said so many times. But instead of having committees and new commissions, please implement whatever reforms you are doing with good faith and convince the IMF. I don't think the IMF is so blind to the realities, and convince your bilateral donors that either you convert, as Zeelaf said, and I wrote this 2 weeks ago, into equity investments. We need a petrochemical complex, we need refinery, we need aluminum smelter, we need copper smelter, we need batteries for lithium batteries. There are so many things which these countries, which are capital rich, can help us in doing that, which will provide the raw materials for the downstream industries, and our deindustrialization will become industrialization. Agriculture productivity is so low. China can come and help you as far as your agriculture productivity is concerned. Ask China, don't give us the deposits, give us the know-how and investment in order to turn around our agriculture, and 10% increase in our yields will make us self-sufficient and remove $10 billion of imports. So these are the game plan which I think the government should do in order to get out of this racket of every 3 years we have to go to the IMF and try to constrain our growth.
Right. Thank you,
Jerry,
Dr.
can I just say one thing?
Adnan, yes, Jay.
Just very quickly, 1 minute. Dr. Ishrat, I do not disagree with anything that you said. And you know that. And you know that my boss also believed that. Just one thing, about the civil service reforms, and because you know how closely they're intertwined with the SOE reforms and the corporate governance that you pointed out. And that's a complex, to be honest, that we are trying to solve. You know where the pushbacks are coming from. And that's something that we are still trying to tackle effectively so they are viable and lasting. Because if they're not sustainable, as you said, we're going to go back to where we started. So that's in mind. And about the FBR reforms and the tax, for the budget, as Dr. Vaqar mentioned, very briefly on that, we've taken the tax policy office out. It's now in Q block. The DG and the Minister of State, they've been visiting various chambers, talking to all the other stakeholders, because we need to listen to what is required. It has to be measurable in terms of how we will deliver when we give these incentives out as a country. And then also we have to wean people off that as well after a period of time. So that has to be structured in a manner that works for Pakistan. It is not for 3 years or 2 years for someone's tenure. It has to continue 10, 20 years.
Please try
Because
to
without
protect.
that, we will not get any investment even from the local.
No, because I'm running out of time. I just want to alert. Please protect the national tariff policy, which has been, because there's a lot of backsliding on that by the lobbyist groups. That is the best thing this government has done, and you should try to protect it.
Thank you, sir.
So, thank you. We're running out of time. I want to quickly give about a minute each to Dr. Zeelaf and finally to Vaqar on before we close the webinar for today. Dr. Zeelaf, so you set out with a very comprehensive vision for the private sector. Just very quickly, when the time comes, inshallah, we hope that this mediation and diplomacy will yield some real returns for Pakistan. Are you confident that the Pakistani businesses will be in a state of preparation and competitiveness, because there will be a lot of international competition for these regional projects? Dr. Zeelaf?
Gee, just Dr. Ishrat had just mentioned about the investment rate in between the 2002 and 2000 period. 23% had climbed, and that was the point and that was absolutely correct. But it goes to the point of the investment rate looked impressive, but the quality was what determines what happens later, so that we don't get into these cycles. So if it's concentrated in non-productive sectors such as the real estate and only in consumption-led growth, rather than export capacity and capability building, and in industries that are going to provide jobs, that's how we went back. We had to go back into the IMF in 2013 and then 2023, right? With nearly a default. So yes, the diplomatic capital, it should be seen for real. It is not a small measure what Pakistan has been able to do. So do not be shy of asking, because Vaqar was talking about, okay, how do you manage in the next 12 to 18 months with all the kind of restraints and challenges that we're going to have? One of the principal asks from Washington in the in this Trump era, and also from the Pakistan's non-Paris Club creditors, must be to alleviate one of Pakistan's critical binding constraints, which is the debt. So we need to push hard for debt reprofiling, restructuring, innovative debt swapping arrangements, and a hard sell indeed. But because the receptivity of Pakistan and its demand, it probably will never be as high as it is right now. So it really has to be a hard sell. And in the same way with Iran, with its mediatory role, we should seek formal exemptions from the Iran sanctions regime, no matter what happens. So that's where, because it is, whether it's the Iran pipeline, depending, we should actually be looking at how do we have our own energy. We're not, replacing one with the other. It should be cost effective, but there should be, and also trade, and there's going to be a rebuilding. Once peace happens, there would be a rebuilding, reconstruction economy going on there. So this is the time to be talking about, what is it that Pakistan could be doing. And similarly in the trade, there are there are regional trade blocks where Pakistan is blocked out because of India's membership or its clout. So, these are the kind of areas where we may want to be looking at times like these to be doing what otherwise one would not imagine can be done, right? Now, coming to the private sector, and is the private sector going to be ready? Now, again, private sector is also not a homogeneous body, right? So, what one also needs to be looking at is, yes, the private sector that has delivered, that has been able to give consistent results.
Excellent.
That is what you have to be looking at. There is so much historical data, right? Where what do you want to look at? Okay, whatever the variables were, when has export grown? What has export? What have you done to diversify it? Has there been increased growth in non-textile? It may be small, but is it showing incremental, exponential growth? What can be done about those? Demand should be, the supply should be meeting demand. Your capacity, the private sector should be investing in capacity. Let the private sector work, and the market forces will determine what the sectors would be. But that is what it is. Whatever the demand may be, is what the supply should be invested in, but with consistency and longer term policy, so you know that the investment is not going to be now in terms of look, if I were to say what is it that in the medium to longer term bets Pakistan or we should be looking at, it is our youth, our land, our energy. Everything related to whether you are talking about whether it's demographic dividend or the extreme volatility that can come with it, whether it is pivoting that to the technology and IT sector, whether it is agri-tech and AI related and productivity and yield enhancing agriculture. I mean, agriculture for an agrarian economy, we should, it's unfortunate that we have the kind of food security in such a large population with 7.5 million people in 45 vulnerable rural districts facing acute food insecurity, and 40% of stunting in areas, and 50% labor female labor participation under 20%. All these are actually opportunities, and agriculture actually provides those opportunities if you tie in technology, the right kind of investments, productivity, yield. The GCC should be investing in those. You can actually be the food basket with the right kind of water management. So, and then when we talk about energy, we should be looking at how do we get energy independent eventually. So right now we are like what we say 46% renewable. If we add hydro into that, get the investment in renewable energy. So so if we start thinking along those lines of how does Pakistan right now in this time period, in whatever, actually it's been amazing what the Pakistani leadership has been able to do. So one needs to be complimenting and congratulating, because it's a very, very fine line and a very fine rope. And largesse is never altruistic in the international politics, but how we use that, how we channelize that, I think now is the moment everybody should be thinking about it.
Thank you, Dr. Zeelaf. Very, realistic aspirations. And I think everybody would agree with you on the centrality of performance and capability. Those who have performed and delivered consistently will have, they will be driving the future. And I do want to acknowledge it here before I come to Waqar for the final word. The point raised by Adnan earlier in his comments, and then you, Dr. Zeelaf, about how Pakistan needs to actively start looking at sanctions relief vis-a-vis trade, especially energy trade with Iran. I think probably that is a point that requires more public debate. Certainly, when we look at how Russia and India have leverage the current moment to their advantage. Waqar, finally to you, very quickly in about a minute, you put your finger on the vulnerability of the SMEs. And here in this forum, for about an hour now, we've talked about the need for growth. We know growth will come through innovation, through productivity, through hardcore delivery on the grassroots, and it's the SME which is the link. It is the SMEs everywhere who are supposed to drive that growth. Now you are foreseeing a very tough time for SMEs, rightly so. In this context, what would be your recommendation, one or two concrete steps to arrest this premature kind of death of SME sector as Pakistan navigates the stress points?
Very, very good question. I'd like to see everything that we did under COVID for the SMEs. So we had a turf program, we had concessional financing, we had tax relief, we had, there was a startup revolution that nobody talks about, that took place during and after the third wave of COVID, primarily because government was on its toes and it did everything it could to not only protect SMEs but also promote formalization. So that's an opportunity that the forthcoming budget has. Second, one of the casualties of this crisis has been the cut on public investment. So we have had to reduce a lot of PSTP and divert it to social protection, rightly so. But what happens is that large part of this PSTP is going into, or ADP, provinces ADP, is going into the productive capacities of these SMEs, the enabling infrastructure which these SMEs require. I think we need to win that public investment or the room for that public investment back in these forthcoming federal and provincial budgets.
Thank you, Waqar. Ladies and gentlemen, with this, we come to the end of our webinar. I wish we had another hour. The conversation has been so rich, and I feel that we only started. I really thank our esteemed panelists for their precious time and fantastic original insights and recommendations, as well as to our live audience who joined us today. I think if there's one takeaway from today in this discussion, it is that in the world that is being shaped by shocks, and as Dr. Ishrat Hussain says, great power competition, more and more so, uncertainty is now a constant. And the real question is not how we respond, but how capable and prepared we are for what becomes next. Thank you, and have a good evening or day wherever you are.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.